We are back, and I am thrilled to be joined by the hosts of the Blowback podcast, which is phenomenal, Noah Kulwin and Brendan James, and it comes out tomorrow, season 5. Check it out, folks. How you guys doing, Noah and Brendan?
Pretty good. Excited.
Same tale of woe for me. I disagree with Noah.
So this season's on Cambodia. We had you guys on, I think, for your season 4, which was Afghanistan. You did the Iraq War, Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, the United States' involvement in Cuba, season 3, the Korean War, then Afghanistan, and now we're here, the story of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, the United States' involvement. Either of you guys can take this, but why did you decide to talk about Cambodia? It's really not in the public's mind whatsoever, given the secrecy that the bombing campaign kind of operated under.
Well, we had often been asked to do a Vietnam season, and we will never acknowledge what fans want us to do ever, let alone do it. But of course, it was in our minds. But it's such. I mean, that's the one war that I don't think is dying, for a yet another treatment from some kind of American piece of media. However, the Cambodia story was a way into that whole conflict, because the Vietnam War really wasn't just the Vietnam War. It was this whole, we call it like a constellation of conflicts, where that was the initial catalyst. And so talking about, secret bombing raids and coups and assassinations, and then, of course, the sort of bait and switch of dealing with the Khmer Rouge to get back at other local enemies of America. That was all very attractive to us to get into, and might have things to say about, of course, the news cycle today.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it occurs to me in Vietnam, right? The protests and I guess the cultural mythology behind it seems to be inextricably linked to Americans dying, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way that when we talk about genocide and World War II, for example, the United States is diligent in portraying us as the moral actors that stood up to Germany and was against the Holocaust, obviously, which flies in the face of the fact that we turned away Jews that were fleeing, but now also that the Soviet Union lost 20 million people fighting the Nazis, but we get to be the victors in that situation. It's so that in particular, I feel like, is informative in how the anti-communism mythology came to be post-World War II, and how U.S. empire spread its tentacles around the world in Vietnam, but then, of course, in Cambodia, where we carpet bombed an entire country. Noah, if you could just take it from there.
Sure. I mean, I think that the one thing that we were attracted to about the season, to build on something that Brendan said, not so much attracted to the atrocity, but seeing how this story brings together so many different elements of what we have talked about and who we've talked about in previous seasons. I think that we've gotten a really interesting cast of characters this season, and sort of communicating the scope of that story that you're talking about, because it's not really possible without some really unique personalities, who are there to guide history on its path. Richard Nixon, also the erstwhile royal of Cambodia, or rather late royal, Sihanouk, and Henry Kissinger, of course, and the personalities of the Khmer Rouge themselves, whose definite, their distinct personalities are what produced the distinct tragedy of the Cambodian genocide.
And the characters that you describe here, if you could just flesh that out a bit, because, Kissinger and Cambodia are inextricably linked. But my understanding is that, LBJ was really they had already begun bombing Cambodia under Lyndon B. Johnson. So what was that period that obviously Nixon and Kissinger built upon? If you could take us through that.
Yeah, I mean, there were sporadic bombings because the border was so porous. between Cambodia and Vietnam, the Viet Cong began to use it. The Americans called it sanctuaries. It's not totally inaccurate. I mean, they were trying to cool off from the action that was going on in Vietnam. But generally speaking, aside from some special forces stuff and the Phoenix program, crossing into Cambodia, it really was the invention of Nixon and Kissinger that took it to the concentrated effort to bomb Cambodia and bring it fully into the war. Their argument was, of course, that we inherited all of this, and to a degree that's true. Although they sabotaged the '68 negotiations that were happening in order to win the election and promise the South Vietnamese regime a better deal. So it's a little bit of it's more than a little bit of a Nixonian and Kissingerian thing to say, oh, we inherited this even though we rigged it to keep going. But
and also, one thing I'll jump in to add quickly is that also bombing Cambodia, if you read newspapers from 1968 and you look at conservative and right wing and sort of military and intelligence community aligned news outlets, think tank types and activists, they talked very actively about bringing the war into Cambodia as a way of solving it. So when Nixon and Kissinger went about trying to end the Vietnam War by expanding it and attacking communist positions in Cambodia, it wasn't something that they had invented out of whole cloth. They were rummaging around in a right-wing policy toolkit that was screaming, that had like this big wrench in it that said bomb Cambodia. And that's how they just chose to go about it the way they did.
One general called it, basically when the wolves are closing in, you throw them a body, and that was Cambodia. So it was essentially, an expedient way to withdraw American troops, Vietnamize the war in Vietnam, make it into more of a proxy battle, and Cambodia paid the price for that.
And so the approach, how did that shift? You hinted at it a little bit, but when Nixon and Kissinger got into power, can you speak a little bit about that escalation and what their supposed strategic objectives were in Cambodia?
Sure. So when Nixon came into office, his main mandate was essentially to end the Vietnam War. And famously, he said that he would get peace, but he would get peace with honor. And that meant that the U.S. wasn't going to turn tail and run out of Vietnam, but as he sought to Vietnamize the war, to withdraw troops, rely more on South Vietnamese forces, and also, and this was less publicly discussed or at least bragged about, to just bomb and waylay with bombs and munitions what they believed to be communist areas of operations, but were just obviously huge swaths of countryside where civilians were living. And they thought, though, and they recognized that this idea, part of this is Nixon's natural predilection for secrecy, but they correctly believed that, well, Cambodia is a neutral country. So if we just start openly bombing Cambodia, then, that'll give the impression perhaps that we're at war with this neutral country that wants to be neutral. And while the head of Cambodia, Sihanouk, had ostensibly said like, oh, he knew about the bombing, supported it, he was kind of over a barrel. And I think the one sort of dimension I would just add to the final piece of it to describe is that Nixon and Kissinger then, after deciding that we needed to bomb Cambodia, it had to be in secret, they went about creating what was known as the false or dual reporting system, where they basically created an entirely separate set of books that they could use to run the Cambodian operations. They burned all the figures. They lied about it completely. It was run directly from the White House and through Kissinger to the highest levels of the military, to the actual airmen who were carrying out the operation and who are running, essentially, again, after they finished these bombing missions, which they first called Operation Breakfast and then Operation Menu as it went on for months, it was, again, to stress, entirely secret, and was actually the basis for, when it was revealed in part in a New York Times article, was the basis for the first Nixon witch hunt. So this Cambodia bombing was like the dirty secret of the Nixon administration in its first couple of years.
And can you guys just maybe do a little bit of myth busting about the nature of, say, like Soviet support in these areas? I mean, I'm obviously we're thinking a lot about the genocide in Gaza and how Iranian-backed proxies is very much used as a propaganda tool in order to justify escalation. I think you could draw some real parallels to how the Soviet Union is portrayed in Vietnam and then by extension, of course, Cambodia.
Definitely. In Vietnam, there's no doubt the Soviets were giving aid to the Vietnamese, both militarily and diplomatically. Support, was open. So did the Chinese. Although another interesting thing about this season of our show is that this is the height of the Sino-Soviet split that's happening. So China and the Soviet Union are at odds, almost more than the U.S. is at odds with either of them. And that factors into the story in a big way because the U.S. and China will eventually meet at an embrace under the Nixon and Kissinger diplomacy. But the Soviet Union had nothing to do whatsoever with the Khmer Rouge. In fact, they were creeped out by them and eventually...
Can you explain who the Khmer Rouge are too as well for the audience that may need a bit of a primer on this?
For the Zoomers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the millennials and the Gen X and the Zoomers.
The Khmer Rouge, if the name Pol Pot rings a bell, the Khmer Rouge were a communist insurgency within Cambodia that originally was just kind of like an auxiliary force to the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong did most of the fighting in Cambodia. It was only till the very end of the war that the Khmer Rouge, which were the local communists, started to pick themselves up. And they claimed they were victorious in the civil war in Cambodia that our invasion kicked off. And they went on for the next 3.5 years to impose probably the most total sort of violent vision of like the parody of what communism in the Black Book of Communism could be. Some don't even argue it was communism because it was so detached from any kind of logical program, but forced labor all across the country, extermination of ethnic minorities, hence the Cambodian genocide, and just mass executions known as the killing fields. That was the immediate result of the end of the war in Cambodia that America had started. And then, as kind of the second half of our show, we move into what is often less discussed, which is the U.S. collaboration with the Khmer Rouge to strike at Vietnam once we had withdrawn from that country. So we became partners with the Khmer Rouge. We defended their seat at the UN. We sent them under a coalition. We sent them military and financial support. That is to say, the Soviet Union at the time was with Vietnam and the Eastern Bloc trying to unseat the Khmer Rouge after they had been driven from power by the Vietnamese, trying to completely stamp them out. And we were standing in the way. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the guy who had organized the Mujahideen, was the same guy who was behind the Khmer Rouge policy.
And dad of Mika, who
of lovely
you may
Mika.
be familiar with from Morning Joe. So the Khmer Rouge, their rise in Cambodia. Can you give us a little bit of a timeline in terms of how the bombing campaign correlated with the Khmer Rouge and then the United States' support for the Khmer Rouge? They committed mass genocide in the country of Cambodia too.
Yeah. So we're really talking about a specific period of, like 69 to 75, which is the sort of covering the rise of the Khmer Rouge beginning from the period of the bombings, because the bombings begin in 69 and they are not just an escalation in, horrible violence and tragedy for Cambodians, but it also becomes an escalation in policy that Nixon then makes explicit the following year with the announcement of an invasion of Cambodia. Now, this is an invasion of South Vietnamese troops going into southern Cambodia with the assistance and support of the American army. And the Cambodian invasion which is preceded by a coup that removes Sihanouk and installs an American client dictator named Lon Nol, who is literally insane. He had a stroke. He was an unwell man. And like a Buddhist, just a strange, like Khmer supremacist, who preceded the Khmer Rouge. And so Lon Nol comes into power and he really runs this like rather shambolic state. And by dislodging Sihanouk from power, who then joined up with as a symbolic leader, the Khmer Rouge, all of a sudden the Khmer Rouge, this kind of, I don't want to say rinky-dink, but small and marginal compared to previous, forms of Khmer insurgent struggle against Sihanouk, all of a sudden they are the most significant game in town. And they are supported very seriously by China. And at this time, before the end of the American War, or at least before, while South Vietnam is still around, they're also supported by Hanoi and North Vietnam, although that will eventually change. And so the Khmer Rouge are sort of this, like truly a wild card. Not much was known about them. They cultivated that about themselves. It wasn't just because like the people were ignorant. It was they actively sought the mystery and to play down their role in influencing the sort of broader movement that they positioned themselves as part of. And then, of course, they revealed themselves through their actions and publicly announced themselves a couple of years in. But, the rise of the Khmer Rouge is essentially made possible because of American-supported machinations. That 1970 coup that installed the nutty guy Lon Nol, even if the CIA didn't necessarily plan it from Langley and organize it themselves, they were on board with it. In however broadly you want to interpret that. And so I think that you can kind of sort of draw a straight line to, April 75, when the Khmer Rouge take over, to this, rising, amount of American interference and kind of, destruction of the Cambodian political order that was, what came after the beginning of the literal destruction of the Cambodian countryside.
And the value of the Khmer Rouge for Nixon, Kissinger, the CIA, etc. Is it just like they were gonna keep slaughtering people in North Vietnam? That was part of it for them, or was there also? I mean, there's propaganda value clearly in them labeling themselves as communist, and what. Can you talk about the inauthenticity of that and, the Soviets and how they viewed the Khmer Rouge, or expand even more on that point?
Yeah, so as Noah just laid out, that was everything up till they took over. The
Right.
Americans were not allied with them during their time in power. They didn't really do anything to dislodge them, but they weren't allied with them. Although Kissinger did say, while they were in power privately, we'll make friends with them. The fact that they're murderous thugs we won't let that get in our way. So there was obviously going to be a shift because already Vietnam had whipped America in the war. 75, America's out of that war, and Vietnam's unified again. And it was starting to look like the Khmer Rouge, this strange, isolated movement in Cambodia, would be a good blunt instrument against Vietnam. Because Vietnam, another strain of our story in this season, is the attempt at normalization between Vietnam and America. And Nixon had promised them war reparations, which we never gave them. And so
No.
that they were really pushing for those war reparations, which would have been a whole year of GDP for them. Instead, what they got was increased attacks on their border from the Khmer Rouge, because Pol Pot, essentially things were going south. People unsurprisingly did not enjoy the killing fields, and they knew that they needed an external enemy in order to retain some legitimacy. And so that's when they started attacking Vietnam. Yeah.
To emphasize that things were going really wrong and that Vietnam was the answer to that. This was a country that had never known famine, that had never known, serious issues. But because they evacuated, the first thing the Khmer Rouge did was evacuate the capital city of Phnom Penh, which by that point was overstuffed with refugees from the countryside. You all of a sudden had all of these people who had, many of whom had no experience whatsoever in rural life, who are now essentially being forced to do extremely draining and often, pointless, radical agricultural labor. And so, as you can imagine, when that society began to break down, there really, and the whole structure of that order began to break down within Cambodia. Let Brendan go back to it now, but that was this. It was, it's hard to understate just how much the violence against the Vietnamese clearly grew out of and was exacerbated by a catastrophic state of dysfunction that had been reached within 18 months of being in power.
Yeah, this was the war after the war. Everyone knows the Vietnam War. What came after was the quote-unquote Third Indo-Chinese War, after the French, after the Americans. And that was the Khmer Rouge versus Vietnam. And Vietnam went in 78, December of 78, and said, we're getting rid of this Pol Pot guy. He's slaughtering our citizens across the border. He's slaughtering people inside of Cambodia. And Vietnam kicked out Pol Pot. And bafflingly, looking back on it today, this was met with international condemnation led by the United States. Because of Vietnam aggression, Imagine invading a country in Indochina and breaking their sovereignty. That's what the Americans said, and so they were punished. There was a famine looming because of Khmer Rouge policy, and America blocked food and humanitarian aid from going in to punish the now Vietnamese allied government that had replaced the Khmer Rouge. And that's when we do our Faustian bargain with the Khmer Rouge. They become an insurgency. And again, much like the Mujahideen, we say through Brzezinski that this is the blunt instrument we will use to attack Vietnam for the next 10 years while they occupy Cambodia. And that's when you get them literally being a part of U.S. policy until the early 90s, in which they are still carrying out, albeit as an insurgent force, the same kinds of policies they were always doing while they were in power. And Pol Pot, and by the way, Pol Pot traded his Mao jacket for safari suits and pastel colors and said, we need to follow the West now. We're not communists anymore. To your point, Emma, about the ultimate disposable utility of socialism. I think originally they did consider themselves socialists, but they were really more just xenophobic nationalists at the end of the day.
And there's a one other dimension of that sort of initial period when America in 80, 81, and then throughout the 80s is sort of standing with the Khmer Rouge insurgency and against Vietnam, is that a couple months after Vietnam kicks out the Khmer Rouge, like we're talking like a matter of 7 to 8 weeks, it becomes clear, and then China follows through on its own in attack on Vietnam, which is mostly a symbolic strike. But the sort of purpose of it is to back up and sort of demonstrate to Vietnam that, like, listen, you may push the Khmer Rouge out of power, but you're still going to have like this, we're still going to be here supporting them against you. And we, like the Chinese leadership at that point, led by Deng Xiaoping, who sort of rather famously called the Vietnamese the hooligans of the East. They have a sort of long-standing geopolitical rivalry that exists outside of the Cold War world order.
He also called them the Cubans of the East, which is funny because the Cubans were allied with the Soviets, and the Chinese were like, "You think
How
the
many
Cubans
more
are
things
bad?"
of the East can we call them?
I don't know.
But so China then attacks Vietnam, and it's it's like they retreat, and it's very damaging, and people take losses and what have you. But it's also to sort of illustrate that, like, what is also going on here is not just that we're teaming up with the Khmer Rouge to punish Vietnam, but that we are able to team up with the Khmer Rouge because we have these really good friends in the Chinese, and yes, other countries like Thailand. But the Chinese are the really important ones, and the Chinese will then become our friend. And it's also a story about the dawn of the kind of world order that is now ending, in which the Chinese and sort of Chinese manufacturing base and the rising the Asian tiger economies were such an important part of global growth in the last 40 years. But now we are obviously seeing the U.S.
retreating from that.
West, precisely,
right.
Which sort
for
of
our
is,
own interests capitalistly, obviously, because onshoring this kind of stuff just makes more sense for bottom line. And then, I mean, even our economic policy is framed in competition with China. That was in part what we're still embroiled in the Middle East, but administrations for the past 2 decades have wanted to move towards a more militant policy towards China as like a sole focus.
The Asia pivot. And Obama's Asia pivot.
There's a real, to your point on reshoring, what this means, though, for these other, smaller countries in the region, Vietnam, Cambodia, Vietnam is actively seeking to absorb a lot of this manufacturing capacity from the West that's being taken out of China. They're appealing to European automakers and industrial powers, American automakers and industrial powers. And Cambodia, for what it's worth, is making a similar pitch, but it's also more aimed at the Chinese. And Vietnam, even though they're a historic rival of China, and they have ongoing, long-standing territorial disputes with China over famously the Spratly and Paracel Islands. You now have this situation where I think these countries, we're somewhat holding our breaths because a lot of it's dependent on how aggressive the U.S. wants to be, or at least that'll sort of be what lays out how powerful we really still are. But I think that it's, sort of this, we are now seeing this era end in which we had built a world with China aligned against Vietnam and these other countries. And it's now settling into a more sort of generally ambiguous position where we're both freaked out that the Cambodians are allying with China, but also, we're not that freaked out because we have a lot of money invested in these places too. And we're, like the head of Cambodia now went to West Point. It's a lot more complicated. It's not.
Yeah,
as
it's
black
much
and white.
more. It's a new Cold War in a lot of ways, but it's so much more symbiotic than the relationship between the Eastern Bloc and the so-called free world was. There were actual blocs. That's gone now.
Well, there's
it's much
no
more.
ideological. Well, it's all capitalistic at the end. It's like, so base, right? There's less of that fight. I think I would argue in
Yeah,
this.
I mean,
version.
if some would say the Chinese are in the middle of their NEP that's just way longer than Lenin's, I mean, there's all kinds of ways you could slice it, but they're obviously using capitalistic, market mechanisms to build wealth. And whereas we have 750 bases all over the world, they have two, one of which is in Cambodia, by the way, and they're obviously going for the wheel and deal method, which is far less violent but still quite threatening to the U.S.
They brokered those talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
We talked about this last season. Is with Afghanistan, Beijing was far more involved at the end of the Afghanistan war that we started in bringing people together and talking about the future than the Americans were. And in the future, people are going to go to Beijing. They're not going to go to Washington for whatever, a handout or a mediator, and we can see that happening. So while Cambodia is now, these days, not a hotspot, I suppose you would say, it is the site of the largest Belt and Road Initiative. And it is one of those places that's spelling out this larger conflict between China and America. And one last thing I'll say to make our season sound relevant and therefore mandatory to listen to is...
It's already mandatory. Go on.
Thank you. It's just that you guys were talking about Lebanon. I mean, here's an example of, not to compare everything one-to-one, but another country outside of the current zone of conflict being suckered in, and that was Cambodia. It did the best it possibly could to stay out of it. And we see Hezbollah, which is of course in the U.S. spoken of as like the most aggressive, irrational set of actors ever. They are mocked in some cases by the radical, minds on the struggle with Israel, because they don't want to get into it right now. Clearly, they do not want a large scale war, and they've been trying to avoid it up until now, at least. And that is the same kind of balancing act that Cambodia was facing during the events of this season.
And so,
one other thing. Oh,
go ahead, Noah. Yeah.
One other thing that sort of Brendan brought up, and this, we haven't actually brought this up yet, is that we went for the season. We traveled to Cambodia and Vietnam, and we conducted interviews, which will be in the season, and we can say more about in a minute. But one thing that we saw while we were there, so if you look at like a chart of economic growth in Cambodia, the before and after in the last generation is basically the economic crisis. When China and the sort of the Chinese boom lifted the world out of the Great Recession, Cambodia started to experience meaningful, like double-digit growth for the first time ever. You're talking about, one of the most reliably poor countries in Asia, not just Southeast Asia. And that's still, largely true to this day, but it's grown a lot. And to me, aside from seeing an Al Pacino as Serpico picture on a truck's mud flap, which is still like a fascinating, still can't quite get over that one. I remember we were, taking a motorbike in the outskirts of Phnom Penh, and you saw like a mall that had clearly been built with Chinese capital. And, it had been it was new, had a bunch of clearly Chinese stores on it for many of the Chinese tourists who do come to Phnom Penh and spend money on gambling. There are lots of casinos set up there. But what do we see in this Chinese mall? There's a drive-through Starbucks right there too. And so there is this, you can't, for how, to emphasize and re-emphasize what we've been saying, for as much as people want to make this a new Cold War, the degree of intertwinement, or, the degree to which like we are bound up in each other's shit, as like a world economy and society, like can't be understated, and is like seems to sort of be, I mean, to me at least, is like it was something that I was struck by as a result of our travels there.
And so just to leave a lot of information for the podcast so people, check it out when it drops tomorrow. Overview, what are the final figures of both the bombing campaign and the genocide of the Khmer, that the Khmer Rouge committed, that is on the United States' hands here?
It's estimated that the bombing campaign was maybe around 100 to 150,000. It's obviously a much smaller country than Vietnam, in which the figures for that whole war were 2 to 3 million. The bombing campaign was around that. The Cambodian Civil War is estimated as up to 300,000, maybe 500,000. That's the whole conflict that was touched off by our invasion. The Khmer Rouge genocide, we spoke to the foremost expert on the Khmer Rouge genocide in the English language, Ben Kiernan, Australian scholar, and his numbers are 1.7 million Cambodians dead. The majority being Khmer, fellow Khmers, but the sort of genocidal extermination campaigns disproportionately being directed at the ethnic minorities of ethnic Vietnamese, Muslim Chams, ethnic Chinese, and so on. And taken together, it's obviously one of the great human catastrophes of the past 100 years.
Well, U.S.
Back
Empire.
to you, Emma.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's instructive because, slaughters of this nature, like, again, it's impossible to escape our current context. Like, genocides only count apparently in American culture when we can use them for propaganda value and not like what we have wrought. And like the level of generational trauma that the United States has inflicted upon the world, and impoverishment and disease. I mean, people need to know, so they can listen to both this season that's coming out tomorrow of Blowback to learn about Cambodia, but then of course what we did in Iraq, the Cuban Revolution, the Korean War, Afghanistan. The numbers keep ticking up, and you could check out those previous seasons as well. It's packed with information and so well researched. Really appreciate your time today, guys.
Thank you, Emma.
Okay,
Thank you, Emma.
For sure. And we'll put a link obviously to Blowback in the description wherever you're listening to or watching this.
Hey folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.